Most great wrestlers have some kind of gimmick, whether that be a more outlandish one like the supernatural wizardry of The Undertaker, or something more grounded in reality like the everyman antics of Dusty Rhodes. Really, it's a key part of becoming a successful performer in many ways. Often then, when a good gimmick is stumbled upon, it'll be around for years, if not decades. Sometimes though, that's not the case. No, sometimes a great gimmick gets iced before it can go very far. What are the biggest examples of this? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with the most recent example, Ron Killing's brief rebrand in 2025. Yes, while it's easy to forget now, for a few weeks there during the summer of 2025, Ron Killings was the hottest thing in all of wrestling. And the reason for this was because it was here that TKO informed him that when his contract ran out, it would not be getting renewed. Now obviously, people getting cut from WWE is nothing new, but this time it hit fans differently, as Truth was someone so beloved by the audience, it felt to them like TKO was overstepping their bounds by letting him go. So it was then that an online movement was born to get Ron back in WWE, with this being successful in the end, as pretty soon thereafter he would reappear on TV after having been convinced to sign a new contract by Nick Khan himself. And from there, it looked like we were going to be getting an all-new version of the comedy character, as the next night on Raw, he'd come out to the ring, cut his hair, and announce he was no longer R-Truth, he was Ron Killings, and he wanted to be taken seriously going forward. As we can all see now though, this character has not stuck around. Why is that? Well, despite it being a popular move with the audience, as it allowed Truth to completely reinvent himself as a potential main event act, Triple H obviously didn't have the Charlotte native factored into his plans for the future. No, while he was willing to bring him back in so as to quell the fan backlash once Ron was on TV once more, it wasn't long before he was back to being the same old comedy character as he had been before. And what a shame that is, because a more serious version of Killings really had potential in 2025. Hell, he could have been a real player on either the Raw or the SmackDown brand this year, but alas, it was not meant to. And given this appears to be his last run as an in-ring performer now, it's unlikely Truth will ever get another chance to be taken seriously in WWE. And he's not the only one whose big shot was botched in this way, as the exact same thing would previously happen with our next subject, Waylon Mercy. In Waylon Mercy's case though, it wasn't a failure of creative which nuked his gimmick before it could really bear fruit. No, it was a combination of injuries and the whole thing being just too far ahead of its time. After all, this was a character that, with its Bayou serial killer vibes which had shades of Robert De Niro's portrayal of Max Cady in Cape Fear, was a lot more layered than most other gimmicks we were getting in mid-90s WWF. Hell, this one really stuck out like a sore thumb in the sense that it was less cartoon character and more psychological menace. So great would Waylon Mercy's potential be at this point in time. In fact, it would later go on to serve as a notable inspiration point for Bray Wyatt. And on top of that, echoes of what Dan Spivey was doing can also be seen in the work of Raven, and someone else we'll get to in a moment. Truly, it could have been an iconic part of WWE history if things had worked out just a little differently. But as we said earlier, they didn't. So thankfully, it's at least been able to live on in spirit, if nothing else, through Bray Wyatt, Raven, and that other unnamed performer we've still to get to. Who is that performer? Well, let's find out as we get to him right now, the man known as Joe Gacy. Now, fans of current-day SmackDown will probably know Joe Gacy as a member of the Wyatt Six and one half of the Blue Brand's current tag team champions. And fans of his from way back will be able to identify him as the deathmatch performer of companies such as Combat Zone Wrestling. In between those two periods, however, he was first getting established within the WWE system as part of the NXT roster, where rather than being a follower, he was the leader of his own stable. What did this mean in terms of his gimmick? Well, like with Bray Wyatt, Joe Gacy would play the role of a cult leader of sorts, one who had his crew, the Schism, around him at all times. Yes, during those early days of NXT 2.0, this was one of the bright moments that helped to keep those who were still watching. And it could have led to a lot on the main roster for Joe if things had gone a little differently. Seriously, if the whole situation had been handled just slightly better, we could have been looking at a SmackDown today where Gacy was standing tall as the all-new face of Fear, rather than just being a minion in a group. It certainly would have stood out, as his Charles Manson-esque vibes would have stood in stark contrast to more grounded performers such as Cody Rhodes, Gunther, and Roman Reigns. So why didn't it last longer then? Well, while that's not fully clear, the assumption has always been that WWE just didn't see enough in the gimmick for it to be main roster worthy. Maybe this is because they found it to be a little too similar to Bray Wyatt, or maybe they just didn't see it appealing to a main roster audience. Who knows? We suppose it doesn't really matter though. All that really matters instead is that after his run in NXT came to an end in April of 2024, he'd disappear for a couple of months before reappearing on SmackDown as a member of Uncle Howdy's clan. Sure, there would still be elements of the old Joe Gacy character there. Hell, of all the prematurely dropped characters we're going to be looking at today, this is the one which was able to live on the most, as there's not an ocean of difference between what the New Jersey native was doing then and what he is now. But let's move away from mentally broken characters like Joe Gacy for now, and over to more mentally broken performers instead, as this is the category our next entry falls into, with it largely being the reason a great gimmick he once had was so short-lived. That's right, it's time for us to talk about the Widowmaker. Okay, if you're not familiar with the Widowmaker, then a bit of backstory will be required here. And in order to tell that full backstory, we have to go all the way back to 80s Jim Crockett Promotions. Why is that? Well, because it was there that Barry Windham was first able to break out of the pack as one of the top rising stars of the territory. So high would he rise here, in fact, he'd at one point become a member of probably the most celebrated incarnation of the Four Horsemen. And when that happened, it seemed like only a matter of time until he'd be winning the NWA World's Championship. Except this didn't happen, at least not then. And the reason was because it was around this period that Windham started getting drawn in by the allure of going to WWF and having a big money run there on a worldwide stage. But then who could blame him, as at this point in time, Vince McMahon's promotion was in the midst of his first boom period, and so was the place most performers wanted to go in order to get the most money possible. So it was then that in 1989 he'd make the jump over to WWF, where he'd be rebranded as the Widowmaker. How would the Widowmaker fare in this system? Well, while his gimmick did have a lot of potential, as it was basically his old one of Badass Cowboy, albeit under a different name, things would quickly stall for Barry here. Not because people didn't get behind him, of course, even if he was being portrayed as a heel. The problem with Barry Windham at this point in his career, though, was that pretty quickly after arriving, family issues would cause him to mentally check out when a counterfeiting scandal threatened to tarnish his name forever. Sure, things would work out for Barry in the long run, as following a couple of years working his way back up the card again once he returned to his original home of Jim Crockett Promotions, he'd finally have that run as NWA World's Champion. But while this was good for him, it only further emphasized how much WWF had missed the boat, as there's really no limit to what Barry could have achieved here if things had been just a little different. And he is not the only person who could have been a top guy in WWE had the stars aligned in a different way, as we could say the same thing about our next subject, Kona Crush. Don't remember Kona Crush? Well, that means you probably weren't around for the early days of the New Generation era, as during this period of time he was one of the hottest characters WWF had. Why was that? Well, he was a big, colorful superhero who, with his happy-go-lucky nature, was about as pure white meat of a babyface as they came. Basically, he was everything Vince McMahon was looking for in a replacement to Hulk Hogan when it became clear Hogan's time as the face of the company was running out during the early 90s. Hell, there were even talks of making Crush the next guy in WWF at one point, with his name reportedly being on the list of people the boss was considering. Right there alongside others such as Tito Santana and Bret Hart. As we all know now, though, it would be the Hitman who ultimately got this job, with that leaving the Hawaiian to be relegated back down to more of an upper mid-card role. But then to be fair, for as over as Crush was, it was probably the right idea to go with Bret instead, as he was the stronger performer of the two by far. And once that happened, it meant the Kona Crush gimmick was always going to be on borrowed time until it just became irrelevant entirely. Still, even if this was inevitable, it would have been nice to get a little bit longer with this version of Crush before it disappeared. Unfortunately, however, as early as 1993, he was already turning heel by forming an alliance with Mr. Fuji. And not long after that, Bryan Adams, no, not that one, the other one, would be gone from WWF entirely for a while when he was fired following an arrest over possession of both steroids and an illegal firearm. Sure, he would later return as a member of the Nation of Domination and then, after that, the Disciples of Apocalypse, but things would never be the same for him as they had been during that first run when fans were so behind his gimmick. And we're still not done with gimmicks that could have been the top one in the whole company, but were instead cut short prematurely. No, our next entry also fits that bill all too well, the man then known as the narcissist Lex Luger. Yes, this one is one which happened around the same time as the whole Kona Crush situation, as it was in late 1992 that Lex Luger jumped ship from WCW to the WWF. And in the process of doing so, he'd be given an all-new gimmick, that of a vain heel known primarily as the narcissist. As you would expect then, such a gimmick involved a lot of him looking around admiring his own muscles. Either that or his manager Bobby Heenan admiring them on his behalf. Hell, watching himself flex in front of a series of mirrors was a big part of his entrance early on. And so over did this get with his boss in doing this, it felt like a given that Lex was going to get a push as the top heel of the entire company before long. Enough to where he'd undoubtedly get the WWF title for a while, and probably a lengthy feud with Bret Hart too. So why didn't this happen? Well, after Hulk Hogan left the promotion for good in mid-1993, and Vince McMahon decided that the Hitman was not going to be the man to turn business around again, he decided to go back to his old playbook of using a bodybuilder as a superhero-esque top babyface. So it was then that, in one of the most jarring character shifts ever, Luger would arrive on the USS Intrepid on July 4th of that year to body slam Yokozuna, and in the process, stamp his name as WWF's next ace, with this leading to him going on to challenge the champ at SummerSlam a month later and ultimately failing to win the gold. Sure, the idea behind this was to stretch the whole thing out until WrestleMania 10, at which point Lex could finally win the big one. But by that point, the Lex Express had crashed and burned spectacularly, and instead McMahon was forced to go back to Bret Hart again. Could all of this have been avoided if the total package had just remained a heel? Possibly. It would have likely been better for his WWF career in the long run, that's for sure. After all, had this happened, then there would have been no big challengers to take his place as top heel once Yokozuna was dispatched of. When put in direct competition to Bret Hart in the babyface rankings, however, Luger was just never going to be able to compare. And it was the same shift from babyface to heel which ultimately spelled the doom of our next entry before his gimmick had a chance to fully run its course, the original heel version of Doink the Clown. Now here was a character that was really something special. And if you only remember the more child-friendly babyface version of Doink, then you're missing out on so much. After all, in his original incarnation, he was less of a cackling prankster and more of a truly chilling villain, one who felt like a nightmare come to life at points and who genuinely scared a lot of children in the audience. Basically, it's the difference between the Cesar Romero version of the Joker and the Heath Ledger one. One felt like a comic book character, and one felt like a true, living, breathing monster. But then given who played Doink during those early days, there was no way the gimmick was going to come off any other way, because in Matt Bourne you had a truly troubled and violent man. So when he donned the makeup then, all of the terror he presented just oozed out of the pores of the character. Why did the heel version of Doink end so prematurely? Well, a big part of the reason for that was because Matt Bourne got himself fired in 1993. And once he was gone and other people like Steve Lombardi and Steve Keirn took over the character, it was never going to be the same as when he'd done it. But then even if Bourne had remained a part of WWF, there's a decent chance Doink would have changed anyways, as by 1993, with Vince McMahon on the verge of rebranding his company as the New Generation, he was looking to go more cartoonish and child-friendly than ever, and this meant a scary, nightmarish clown just wasn't going to fly. No, the truth is, the more neutered, babyface version of Doink was always inevitable. It's just a shame we couldn't have gotten more of that original heel version before this had to happen, though. And that's not the only great heel act we wish we could have gotten more of, because flash forward a decade, and we'd be saying the exact same thing about Hollywood Rock. Yes, well, there have been a lot of great versions of The Rock over the years, corporate champion, top babyface in 2000, and the final boss, just to name a few. Perhaps the best of them all would be Hollywood Rock. Why is this? Well, it was here that we got Dwayne Johnson going all out as a cocky heel who had fallen in love with himself a little bit too much after starting to become a star in the movies. As you would expect then, this led to some great segments, the most notable of which were almost certainly the Rock concerts he held on Raw, segments so good they almost turned him babyface again. But it wasn't just an opportunity to sing along with the People's Champion which made Hollywood Rock as fun as it was. No, there was also the excellent feuds he was a part of. After all, it would be here that he had his final run-in with Stone Cold Steve Austin in a program which ultimately led to the Rattlesnakes' in-ring retirement at WrestleMania 19. And aside from that, there was also Rock vs. Goldberg and the often forgotten Rock vs. Hogan 2, the rematch from WrestleMania 18, which happened at No Way Out in February of 2003. Sadly though, by the time the spring of 2003 was over, Hollywood Rock would be gone. Why was that? Well, he had to leave to film another movie, this time Walking Tall. And when he finally returned again a year later to help Mick Foley take on Evolution at WrestleMania 20, he'd be a babyface once more. What a shame that is then, as there was so much more juice to be squeezed out of this gimmick. Sure, elements of Hollywood rock would come back eventually, most notably during Johnson's final boss run in 2024. Hell, he'd even bring back the rock concerts for one night only here. That said, it wasn't quite the same as it had been before. No, the full scope of the gimmick was long gone by now, probably never to be seen again at this stage in the game. But let's move away from singles acts like the Great One for now, and over to tag teams instead, as sometimes they can have a great short-lived gimmick too. And if you need a perfect example of this being the case, you only need to look towards our next subjects, Axelmania and Macho Mandow. Okay, some explanation might be needed for anyone who wasn't watching this one at the time. Basically, back in the mid-2000s, Damien Sandow had gotten very over for a while as Damien Mizdow, the stunt double for The Miz. And while it was hoped that this would lead to a more serious character for him once he eventually broke away from Mizanin, in the end, WWE chose to keep him in the comedy sphere when, in 2015, he entered the orbit of another funny man act in Curtis Axel. What would these two cook up together? Well, given that this was the point the son of Mr. Perfect was doing his Hulk Hogan parody gimmick, Axelmania, it only made sense that Sandow would take on the form of the Hulkster's most famous partner. So it was then that with his best "ooh yeah" and a packet of Slim Jims by his side at all times, the intellectual savior of the masses morphed into Macho Mandow. And from there, he and Axel went on a pretty entertaining run as a comedy double team within the WWE mid-card. Ultimately though, this was a gimmick which would be cut short before it could fully run its course. And the reason for that had nothing to do with either man involved as it happened. Rather, it was a result of Hulk Hogan briefly being blacklisted from WWE after his infamous tape was leaked to the media. Understandably then, once this story broke, it meant nothing Hogan-related could be on WWE TV anymore, and that meant the whole Meta Powers angle would have to be dropped with immediate effect. What a shame this was for Axel and Sandow though, as while the characters were always going to run their course eventually, there was still more to be done with them before they were given the abrupt axe. But the situation was what it was and nothing was going to change that, so each of them had to move on and try to be content with what they'd been able to do. When it comes to our next subject though, it wasn't outside factors which led to his gimmick being cut short way sooner than it should have done. No, in his case, it was more internal factors which were to blame. Who are we talking about here? Why, Bad News Barrett, of course. Bad News Barrett, what could have been? And we say that because while he did have a good run, there could have been so much more done with it. How did it all start? Well, after the failure of the Nexus angle, Wade Barrett was in dire need of a rebrand if he wanted to rescue his career. And after a couple of years of being lost in the wilderness of the WWE mid-card, the Englishman was finally able to find that when he morphed into Bad News Barrett. Who was Bad News Barrett? Well, to put it simply, he was a troll of a heel who loved nothing more than bringing the vibes of both the babyfaces and the fans down. And the way he did this was by bringing out his traditional gavel, and after slamming it down, letting everyone know in his trademark northern accent, "I'm afraid I've got some bad news." Basically, he was heel heat personified in a person. And like with all great heels, this eventually started to get him over with audiences in a babyface fashion. As you expect then, this was where the problems began because once Wade Barrett started to get over with this gimmick, Vince McMahon decided it wasn't working as it was making him a babyface instead of the heel he'd been written as. So because of that, anything that made this gimmick so fun, including the Bad News catchphrase, was axed. And while Bad News Barrett would remain around for a while after that, by the time early 2015 came around, what remained of the character would be gone too. What a crime this was then, because, as we mentioned a moment ago, there was still so much more to be done with this gimmick. Really, there's no reason it couldn't have had a babyface run, as audiences everywhere were all in on it. Had WWE done this, then it may have even brought Barrett back up to a main event level after the levels he'd fallen to post-John Cena feud. But instead, what we got was another rebrand, this time as the much less popular King Barrett. And after that, it was a straight downward line until the Lancashire native retired from in-ring competition altogether and became a full-time commentator. And he wouldn't be the only one who got over with a comedic heel gimmick which could have revived his career entirely had it not been cut so short, as this statement also applies to our next subject. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Broke Corbin. Now, Broke Corbin is another one which some may not remember today, mostly because it was so short-lived. And if you're one of those people, then here's the reminder. After a couple of years cycling through various gimmicks like the Lone Wolf, Constable Corbin, and King Corbin, Baron Corbin eventually found himself falling down on his luck in kayfabe, with this leading to him going broke. And like that then, Broke Corbin was born here, with the idea that he would come out to the ring every week with increasingly tattered clothes and unshaven facial hair. Yes, this was very much a comedy gimmick, and despite it originally portraying the Kansas native as a heel, after a while it started to get him over as something of a sympathetic babyface. But before this could lead to a full turn for the former Mr. Money in the Bank, the whole thing would be cut short when, after weeks of begging for money through things like his Corbin FundMe site, Baron would find his luck turning around again when, after a trip to Vegas, he was able to win a whole bunch of money. What happened then? Well, now that his dark days were over, he transformed once more, this time into Happy Corbin. That said, given he wasn't the lovable loser anymore, Happy Corbin was never as over with fans. And so it was that pretty soon he started sinking back into the spot of being just a guy on the roster again. Really then, the botch which happened here should be clear for all to see, because while Broke Corbin was always going to have to end eventually, and while him winning his money back was a logical end to that story, there was so much more to mine from the gimmick if it had just been allowed to breathe for a little longer. Alas though, things didn't play out this way, and so we'll never know where things could have gone if the situation had gone just a little bit different and a few more months were allocated for the down on his luck loser gimmick. That said, even if it being aborted too early meant Broke Corbin served as an example of wasted potential in some ways, it was still able to entertain fans while it was a thing. And because of that, it deserves a place in today's video. But then, so does every other entry we've looked at, as they're all examples of how sometimes a gimmick just needs a bit more time before it's ripped away from fans.